A sip of his drink, a sudden cough, a look of confusion, and then silence. Margaret Feidler never thought twice about it. Just another night at home with Edwin. 7 years of marriage, built on love, trust, and, more than anything, laughter. Margaret loved to play jokes. Small harmless pranks that always got a reaction. Edwin was the type to roll his eyes, shake his head, but in the end he always laughed along. That night was supposed to be no different. A quiet evening in dinner, a movie, the kind of night they had shared hundreds of times before. And then, something changed. First, it was nothing. A sip, a pause, a strange look on Edwin's face. Margaret watched, waiting for the moment he would laugh, waiting for him to shake his head, tell her she had gone too far. But the laugh never came. Instead, his breathing quickened. His hands trembled. He tried to speak, but no words came out. And then he collapsed. Margaret didn't understand. It was just a joke. It was supposed to be funny, but now Edwin wasn't moving. And no matter how many times she called his name, he wasn't answering. What happened that night was just the beginning. Margaret Feidler was the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone laugh within minutes. She had an energy that people were drawn to, quick-witted, playful, always looking for ways to lighten the mood. Growing up in Indiana, she had always been the life of the party, the one who turned ordinary moments into something memorable. It was no surprise that she built a career around creativity, working as a freelance graphic designer. She thrived in unpredictability, loved spontaneity, and never took life too seriously. Edwin Feidler, on the other hand, was her complete opposite. He was steady, logical, a man who found comfort in structure. Raised in Ohio, he had built a career as an engineer, a job that suited him perfectly, solving problems, analyzing details, making sure everything was exactly as it should be. He wasn't the kind to take risks or seek out excitement. But that was part of what made their relationship work. Where Margaret brought humor and spontaneity, Edwin brought patience and stability. For 7 years, they balanced each other out, their differences creating a relationship that, to most, seemed effortless. They were a classic case of opposites attracting. Margaret's playful nature was something Edwin had grown used to, her surprises, her jokes, the way she always found ways to keep things lighthearted. He wasn't always the first to laugh, but he never discouraged her. He let her be who she was, just as she let him be himself. Pranks had always been part of their relationship. Small, harmless things, Margaret switching Edwin's morning coffee with decaf just to see how long it would take him to notice, Edwin pretending to forget their anniversary only to surprise her with a gift later in the day. It was never mean-spirited, never something that crossed the line. At least, that's what everyone believed. But in the months leading up to that night, something had changed. Edwin had been more withdrawn than usual. He was working longer hours, coming home exhausted, quieter than before. Lawrence Feidler, his older brother, had noticed it too. Edwin seemed distracted, always lost in thought. His mother, Susan Feidler, had asked him about it more than once. Was something wrong? Was work becoming too much? Edwin had brushed it off. He always did. He wasn't the type to complain, the type to make a big deal out of things. Margaret noticed it too, but she had always believed that stress came and went. Work was demanding and everyone had tough weeks. She never thought much of it. Never questioned whether it was something more. But maybe she should have. Maybe there was something she missed. It was a quiet Saturday evening in March, the kind of night that felt routine. Edwin and Margaret had spent the day running errands, doing things that felt small, forgettable, things they had done 100 times before. Now they were home, settling in for the evening. Pizza was on the table, a movie playing in the background, the kind of easy night that married couples fall into without thinking. Margaret scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly while Edwin focused on the screen, half listening to her commentary, responding just enough to let her know he was paying attention. At some point, an idea crossed her mind. A prank. Nothing serious, nothing harmful, just something to get a reaction. She had seen similar videos online, couples playing small tricks on each other, laughing at the over-the-top reactions. She glanced at Edwin, still watching the movie, and made a quick decision. She got up, went to the kitchen, and swapped his drink with a mixture she threw together in seconds. Soy sauce, vinegar, hot sauce, and a pinch of salt. Enough to taste awful, but nothing dangerous. She smiled to herself, imagining the way he'd react. He'd take a sip, cough, make a face, maybe even curse under his breath. She could already hear him saying, "Really, Margaret?" in that amused but exasperated tone he used whenever she pulled something like this. She grabbed her phone, positioned it to capture his reaction, and waited. Edwin reached for his drink without looking, bringing it to his lips as he focused on the screen. The moment he took that first sip, everything changed. His face twisted in confusion, then discomfort. He coughed hard like something had caught in his throat. Margaret laughed, expecting him to spit it out, maybe shake his head. But then his breathing changed. His hand moved to his chest. His eyes widened, searching for something. His fingers clenched at the fabric of his shirt. The glass slipped from his grip, crashing to the floor. "Edwin?" Margaret's laughter faded instantly. No response. She got up, stepping toward him, expecting him to groan, to shake it off. But he didn't move. His breathing was shallow, unsteady. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but no words came out. "Edwin." Her voice was sharper now, panic creeping in. She grabbed his shoulders, shaking him lightly at first, then harder. His body was limp. His skin looked wrong, his face pale. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone again, but this time it wasn't to record. It was to call 911. The operator's voice was calm, steady, but Margaret could barely process what they were saying. "My husband, he's not breathing. Please, hurry." The next few minutes stretched on like hours. Margaret dropped to her knees, trying to follow the instructions she was given. She pressed against his chest, counting out loud like they told her to, tears blurring her vision. The front door burst open. Paramedics flooded the room, taking over, voices overlapping as they worked quickly, urgently. She stumbled back, pressing herself against the wall as they tried to revive him. Someone was speaking to her, asking her questions, but all she could do was watch. Watch as they lifted him onto the stretcher. Watch as they rushed him out the door. She followed, her heart pounding in her chest, a single thought looping in her mind, over and over. It was just a joke. It wasn't supposed to be like this. At the hospital, time moved in slow motion. Nurses rushed in and out of the room, voices low, movements urgent. Margaret sat in the waiting area, hands clasped so tightly they ached. She could still feel the weight of Edwin's body as she had tried to wake him, the way his chest refused to rise beneath her shaking hands. Then, a doctor appeared. His face was unreadable, but Margaret already knew what he was going to say. Edwin was gone. The words barely registered. It didn't make sense. He had been fine. They had been watching a movie, talking, laughing. How could someone just be gone? She shook her head. No, that's not possible. But the doctor's expression didn't change. There was no misunderstanding. No mistake. Edwin wasn't coming back. The questions started soon after. What had he eaten? Had he been feeling sick before this? Had Edwin taken anything? Margaret barely heard them. None of it made sense. She kept repeating the same thing. It was just a joke. It was supposed to be funny. The confusion in the doctors' faces deepened. Edwin's symptoms pointed to poisoning, but no obvious toxin had been found. They needed more answers. And so did the police. Detective Charles Patterson arrived at the hospital not long after. He had been in law enforcement for nearly 3 decades, long enough to know that things were rarely what they seemed. A healthy man doesn't just drop dead in his own home without warning. Margaret was still in shock when he sat across from her, his notepad open, pen in hand. She told him everything. The prank, the drink, how she thought Edwin would just laugh it off. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her voice breaking as she described the moment he collapsed. But something about her story felt incomplete. A prank, a harmless joke. And now, a dead husband? The officers asked for her phone. Routine evidence collection. Margaret didn't think twice before handing it over. But when they played the video, everything changed. The footage was clear. Edwin drinking, coughing, and then his body shutting down. But it wasn't just what happened that caught their attention. It was Margaret's reaction. She laughed. It lasted only a second, but it was there. A moment of amusement before she realized something was wrong. Detective Patterson rewound the clip. Watched it again. Was it nervous laughter? Did she think he was playing along? Or had she hesitated? Had she waited too long to call for help? Margaret swore she hadn't. She told them she dialed 911 the moment she knew something was wrong. But how long had that moment taken? As the investigation continued, an autopsy was performed. The toxicology reports came back first. No poison, no foreign substances in Edwin's system. That only deepened the mystery. If it wasn't the drink that killed him, then what had? Then, Dr. Wendy Bowling, the medical examiner, found something buried in Edwin's medical history, something even he hadn't known, a heart condition. Undiagnosed, hidden, the kind of condition that, in most cases, wouldn't show itself until it was too late. And that's exactly what happened. The prank itself hadn't been deadly, but the shock, the sudden jolt to his system, it had triggered cardiac arrest. His heart had given out almost instantly. For the doctors, it was a tragic medical event, a freak accident. But for law enforcement, it wasn't so simple. Detective Patterson reviewed the facts again. Margaret had admitted to switching the drink. She had laughed before realizing something was wrong. She had waited how long? A minute? 2? Before calling for help. It was an accident. But was it also something more? The case was handed over to the district attorney's office. Some saw it as a medical tragedy. Others saw it as something else entirely. A man was dead, and now they had to decide whether his wife should pay the price. The case moved quickly from a tragedy to a courtroom battle. What had started as a prank was now being scrutinized under the weight of the law. Was Margaret Feidler a grieving wife who had made a terrible mistake? Or was she responsible for her husband's death in a way that demanded punishment? Prosecutor Gene W. Miller stepped forward, addressing the jury with the authority of someone who had seen negligence turn deadly before. He didn't need to convince them that Margaret had intended to harm Edwin. That wasn't the argument. The case was about responsibility and whether Margaret had failed in hers. "This is not about intent," he told the jury, pacing the courtroom. "It is about consequence." He let the words settle before continuing. "Negligence is when someone fails to recognize a danger that any reasonable person should see. Margaret Feidler didn't poison her husband, but she did set a chain of events into motion, a reckless decision that led to a preventable death." He pointed to the video which had been played in the courtroom multiple times. Edwin drinking, coughing, struggling to breathe, the glass slipping from his hands. And then, that one moment, Margaret laughing. "She thought it was funny," Miller continued, his voice steady. "While Edwin was gasping for air, she was still laughing. And in those crucial seconds, while she thought it was a joke, his body was shutting down." He paused, letting the image linger in the jurors' minds before delivering his final blow. "If you start a fire, even accidentally, you are still responsible for the destruction it causes. Margaret Feidler started a fire, and that fire took Edwin's life. Then came the defense." The case moved quickly from a tragedy to a courtroom battle. What had started as a prank was now being scrutinized under the weight of the law. Was Margaret Feidler a grieving wife who had made a terrible mistake? Or was she responsible for her husband's death in a way that demanded punishment? Prosecutor Gene W. Miller stepped forward, addressing the jury with the authority of someone who had seen negligence turn deadly before. He didn't need to convince them that Margaret had intended to harm Edwin. That wasn't the argument. The case was about responsibility and whether Margaret had failed in hers. "This is not about intent," he told the jury, pacing the courtroom. "It is about consequence." He let the words settle before continuing. "Negligence is when someone fails to recognize a danger that any reasonable person should see. Margaret Feidler didn't poison her husband, but she did set a chain of events into motion, a reckless decision that led to a preventable death." He pointed to the video which had been played in the courtroom multiple times. Edwin drinking, coughing, struggling to breathe, the glass slipping from his hands. And then, that one moment, Margaret laughing. "She thought it was funny," Miller continued, his voice steady. "While Edwin was gasping for air, she was still laughing. And in those crucial seconds, while she thought it was a joke, his body was shutting down." He paused, letting the image linger in the jurors' minds before delivering his final blow. "If you start a fire, even accidentally, you are still responsible for the destruction it causes. Margaret Feidler started a fire, and that fire took Edwin's life. Then came the defense." Vanessa Kane had spent years in the courtroom, and she knew what this case really was. A tragedy, not a crime. She stood before the jury, her hands resting on the defense table, her voice calm but unwavering. Margaret Feidler loved her husband. They were married for 7 years. You've seen the pictures, the home they built together. She never wanted this. And yet, she is sitting here today, facing a prison sentence for something that was, at worst, a tragic mistake. She turned toward the prosecution's table. My colleague wants you to believe that Margaret was reckless, that she ignored signs of danger. But let me ask you this. How? How could she have known that Edwin had a fatal, undiagnosed heart condition? No one knew. Not Edwin, not his doctor, and certainly not Margaret. She took a step closer to the jury, lowering her voice slightly, making them lean in. If this is a crime, she said, then where does it end? If you play a joke on someone and they trip, are you a criminal? If you scare a friend and they faint, should you go to prison? If this is a crime, then anyone who has ever made a mistake, anyone who has ever done something they thought was harmless, could find themselves in this very seat, accused of something they never meant to happen. She turned to look at the jury, making eye contact with each of them. This is not justice. This is punishing grief. Outside the courtroom, the case had already taken on a life of its own. News channels covered it relentlessly, turning Margaret into a household name. Social media erupted with debates. Was she a careless killer, or was she a grieving widow being unfairly punished? The hashtag Justice for Edwin trended for weeks, with people calling for a harsh sentence. Others countered with hashtag Let Margaret Go, insisting that prosecuting a grieving wife set a dangerous precedent. Legal analysts weighed in on television, arguing whether this was truly criminal negligence or an unprecedented overreach of the law. Edwin's family was just as divided. His older brother, Lawrence, sat through the trial, never voicing his opinion publicly. Some days he thought Margaret had suffered enough. Other days he thought she had to be held accountable. But his mother, Susan, was certain. Every day she sat in the courtroom unmoving, her grief carved into her face. To her, it was simple. Margaret had taken her son away and she needed to face the consequences. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury reached a decision. The courtroom was packed as the foreperson stood. Margaret's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. We, the jury, find the defendant. A pause. A second that stretched too long. Guilty of involuntary manslaughter. A gasp broke the silence from somewhere in the courtroom. Margaret didn't move. Didn't breathe. She sat frozen, her mind struggling to process the words. Across the room, Susan Feidler exhaled sharply, her lips pressing together. Lawrence lowered his head. A reporter rushed out of the courtroom to break the news. Judge Paul Jones adjusted his glasses, looking down at Margaret with a neutral expression. The law does not require intent for there to be responsibility, he said. But it does recognize the difference between a tragic mistake and a deliberate act of harm. A pause. Then the sentence. Margaret Feidler, the court hereby sentences you to 3 years in prison with the possibility of early release after 18 months. Margaret blinked. The sound of the gavel hitting the bench barely registered. A bailiff stepped toward her. It was over. But outside this courtroom, the debate was just beginning. 18 months after she entered prison, Margaret Feidler walked free. She had imagined this moment countless times. But now that it was here, it felt empty. There was no relief, no sense of a new beginning. Only the weight of what she was leaving behind and what she could never escape. As she stepped out of the prison gates, a small crowd had gathered, not to welcome her. They were reporters, onlookers, people who had followed her case from the beginning. Some whispered to each other. Others simply watched. No one spoke to her. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, feeling exposed, and kept walking. The car that came to pick her up wasn't one she recognized. She had no home to return to, no husband to welcome her back. There was only silence. The moment her release was announced, the same debates reignited. Social media erupted. Hashtag Justice for Edwin surged back into trending topics. Some people called her a murderer who got off easy. Others believed she had been punished enough. Threats flooded her inbox, messages from strangers who said she should have never walked free. You should have stayed in there forever. You don't deserve a second chance. She didn't respond. She had learned by now that for some, she would always be guilty. But not everyone felt that way. There were those who saw her as a woman who had suffered enough, a widow who had made a mistake and had already paid a devastating price. Still, no amount of debate could change what had already happened. Edwin was gone. And for his family, Margaret's early release only deepened the wound. Lawrence Fiedler, Edwin's older brother, never spoke publicly about the case, not during the trial, not after the verdict, and not when Margaret was released. He had sat in the courtroom for every testimony, every legal argument, never sure how to feel about any of it. Some days he thought Margaret had suffered enough. Other days he thought his brother deserved more justice. But justice and closure weren't the same thing. And now Edwin was still gone and Margaret was free. His mother, Susan, didn't share his conflict. She had spent the trial watching Margaret cry, apologize, plead for forgiveness. But it hadn't mattered then, and it didn't matter now. Margaret had taken her son from her, and no sentence could ever be enough. She never spoke Margaret's name again, never acknowledged her release. Edwin's childhood bedroom remained untouched, the door always closed. His belongings sat exactly where he had left them. His coat still hung by the door. His coffee mug still rested on the kitchen shelf. Some nights, Susan would sit at the kitchen table, running her fingers over old photographs. She should have served more time, she would whisper to no one. But deep down, she knew the truth. No amount of time would ever be enough. Margaret never returned to the home she had shared with Edwin. She sold the house, left the town, moved somewhere quieter, where fewer people recognized her name. But moving away wasn't the same as moving on. For months after her release, she didn't know what to do with herself. She wasn't the same person who had played that prank, who had laughed in those crucial seconds before realizing something was terribly wrong. That version of her was gone. But Edwin was gone too, and nothing could change that. So she tried to make something of what was left. She started speaking at schools, warning about the dangers of reckless pranks. She told her story, her voice steady but always filled with regret. The first time she stood in front of a group of students, she could feel them whispering. Some of them had probably looked her up, read about her case. Did they already have an opinion about her? Did they think she was a killer? She cleared her throat. "I thought it was just a joke," she said. "And then my husband was gone." The room fell silent. She told them about Edwin, about how one moment of carelessness had destroyed everything, about how it only takes a few seconds to lose something you can never get back. She ended every talk the same way. "I would give anything to go back and undo that moment. But life doesn't give second chances." And no matter how many times she said it, she knew the truth. Some mistakes can never be undone. One joke, one mistake, a life lost, a woman who never meant harm, but still paid the price. Margaret Fiedler never set out to hurt her husband. She never imagined that a harmless prank could take a life. But the truth is, intention doesn't always erase responsibility. Edwin Fiedler is gone. His family will never get him back. And Margaret will never escape the weight of that night. Some believe justice was served. Others believe this was nothing more than a tragic accident, one that could have happened to anyone. But the question remains, where do we draw the line? When does a joke become something more? Because how many times do we take risks, never realizing we're one step away from losing it all? If you found this case thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime analysis. And in the next video, we explore another shocking case, one where the truth wasn't as simple as it seemed. Stay tuned.